Good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? Oh, wait, hold on. I'm really big on enthusiasm, so my students, they get tired of me when I make them find their enthusiasm. So I'm going to try to not have to do that with us today, okay? So let's try again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
That is much better. How are we doing today?
Good.
Good. All right, I see so many smiling faces here today, so I am excited. That makes me less nervous by seeing all the smiling faces. So thank you. Welcome to our presentation today. We're going to be looking at trauma-informed care practices through multi-tiered systems of support, okay, when looking at working with students with emotional behavior disorders. So we're going to be going through all three of those different tiers and identifying ways that we may be able to merge them together within our classrooms or even within our post-secondary programs. All right, so this is our agenda for today. We are going to start off by going over some introductions to get an idea of who your presenters are, then looking at our objectives. So we're all instructors in here. We understand the importance of objectives and making sure that we reach those at the end of our presentation. So that is our goal. We have our statement of issue, the review of the literature, going into trauma-informed care and emotional behavior disorders merged together, trauma-informed care within MTSS, and then we're going to go into some of the next steps and some questions, and then we'll have a quick little survey at the end to kind of see how do we do, okay? So to start, there we go. So to start us off, my name is Monica Vester. I am a second-year doctoral student at the University of Memphis. My background was social work prior to going into education. So I worked within disabilities advocacy, within mental health. And so I noticed within that career that as I was investigating schools, I was working for the Protection and Advocacy Agency of Michigan. So if any of you are familiar with Protection and Advocacy, they're the mandated organizations. Every state has a federally mandated protection and advocacy service that is required to make sure that the rights of individuals with disabilities are not being violated. And so I worked for the Michigan Protection and Advocacy Service, and through that I noticed with my different investigations, I was like, what is going on in our special education classes? And so instead of going in and saying, do this, I felt it was important for me to go into education and to see it firsthand and see what was going on. And so that's when I made the transition into education through Teach for America in Memphis. And I served as a special education teacher. And it was during my time there that I was able to build even more of an understanding of, okay, what is exactly going on? And I realized it was sometimes some of the practices and the mindsets. And so coming from social work, trauma-informed care is a big buzzword within that field, and noticing within education is becoming a bigger buzzword as well. So it's important that we merge those two. And so my research interests include inclusion, international social work, international social work, but international education, and looking at how is special education being done in other countries as well, and how can we use that to implement within what we're doing here. But then also the importance of knowledge of our administrators and our leaders. What is their knowledge of special education? What are their perceptions of special education and how they view it? So those are my interests.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I guess I'm not going to get the good morning. It's like that. All right, it's all good. Saturday morning. Will Hunter, University of Memphis, Associate Professor of Special Education. I am a former self-contained EBD teacher. I did that for 12 years, former administrator for a charter school in 2 years, was licensed in Kentucky and Ohio. Currently, I am the PI of a $3.5 million grant within the state of Tennessee, and the main charge is to provide technical assistance for K-12 schools with PBIS implementation. However, in Tennessee, it's a AKA RTIB, but it's really PBIS. And also my research interest includes PBIS, student active engagement, closely relevant pedagogy within classroom management. And before we get started, how many teachers do we have in here? Great. How many administrators do we have in here? Great. Faculty members? State representatives that work with the State Department? All right. So I can say that as a former teacher, self-contained teacher, in the last time I was in the classroom was in 2011 as a teacher, I really wish trauma-informed care what's available. It's weird because I worked residential for 9 years within that 14-year span. In my humble opinion, trauma-informed care merges the worlds of mental health and education. And if any of you ever worked in residential, you know that even though they're under the same roof, they do not communicate with each other. So in my humble opinion, trauma-informed care is a perfect bridge to bring mental health and special education together.
Let me stand in the right spot for this. Okay, sorry y'all, technical difficulties. Yeah, we're gonna just sit here. All right, so why are we here today? That is the big question. Why are we here? So our objective is that attendees will participate in a forum that includes a discussion about trauma-informed care in relation to multi-tiered systems of support. And the second objective, attendees will learn trauma-informed methods that you can use in relationship with multi-tiered systems of support. So if you can see, at the beginning, we had you pick up some different handouts, okay? So we're gonna be going through those different handouts through the process of the presentation, so make sure you do not put those away, because we will be asking you to pull those back out, okay? And then we also have an information sheet that's going over different types of interventions that you may be able to implement within the classroom. You might have to press the button. Just press the button. Okay. There you go. Put the left one. There we go. There you go back. Last. Okay. All right, so when we get into trauma, we cannot talk about trauma without first looking at the ACEs scale. So just by a show of hands, who in here has ever heard of ACEs? Okay, the majority of our room have heard of them, so I don't have to go over them too much in depth. So ACEs is Adverse Childhood Experiences. This was a study that was conducted from 1995 to 1997, okay? It was conducted with a little over 17,000 individuals, adults, and it looked at what was their history of trauma, okay? Because they wanted to see if there was a relationship between experiencing trauma and the outcomes of different health events, okay? And so from that, they found that a nice majority of individuals have gone through some form of trauma in their life. It was around 2 out of 3 individuals, okay, had experienced at least 1 to the 10 that's on that ACE scale. So if you see, we provided a copy of the 10 questions that's involved in that ACEs survey, just to get an idea of what it goes over and looks at. So if no one has it, just raise your hand and Dr. Hunter will bring those around to you. So I'm looking at the different adverse childhood experiences that may be experienced. So some of us in here may have experienced ACEs in some way, other individuals within our workforce, as well as our children. So when I first took that ACEs scale, I'm actually a 10 out of 10 on that ACE scale. When you look at me, you would not notice that or know that from my background, okay? And those were things that when I was in the classroom and within school that I wish my teachers would kind of have understood or had an idea of how to handle and work with me, or understanding the importance of educating ourselves on triggers, okay? And so when we look at the different type of common ACEs, we have substance abuse, we have parental separation, so even divorce, that can go in there as being a traumatic experience for children. You have mental illnesses, battered mothers, criminal behaviors, individuals that have been incarcerated. You have sexual abuse, physical abuse, and then you also have neglect that falls within that area of trauma, okay? So if we can go to the next slide. So within ACEs, I have some different considerations when it comes to this, because some individuals may be wondering, hey, is it okay for me to kind of ask my students to take the ACE scale to see where they're at? And it's actually, I don't recommend, just coming from the social work background and understanding that therapeutic aspect, but then within my experience, to not administer it to our youth within K through 12, just because of what it can be. It can be very triggering. And so within that, if you don't have a mental health professional that's there on standpoint for the case of what that trigger may do to your child or that student, you may have a blow up, okay? But I like to use this as a point of information because it's also important when we're looking at trauma-informed care that we're very conscious of our own triggers and we're conscious of our own experiences that we've lived through, because when we work with different individuals, we work from our personal experience, okay? So if we know it's something that we may not be comfortable with, we may not do that with someone else because that's something that we like to withhold from. So it's important for us to be conscious over where we stand at on the ACEs scale. So when we're working with other individuals, we're able to put ourselves on the back burner and be able to understand, like, okay, you know what? That's my trigger talking right now. What can I do in this moment, okay? And so it's also recommended to use the survey as on your reference as well. And yeah, do I have any questions before I go to the next piece? All right. So our statement of the issue. The more trauma a child experiences, the more likely they will experience different health or behavioral problems. Those challenges that are attached to their individual lived experiences are not forgotten at the front door of the school, okay? So when they leave home that morning, say for example, if you have a child who may not eat in the morning, when they leave home, when they get to school, they're not automatically gonna be full, okay? So it's important that they get fed at school, okay? That's another thing that schools started to implement when they had the different free lunches and breakfast and all that. That was something to help within that traumatic aspect that some of our children may not have at home, okay? I know in Memphis, all our schools get free lunch. When I grew up in Michigan, we had it on the system of depending on what your income was, on what you had to pay, but in certain areas they have it where everyone gets it, okay? Because then you don't want to, but then you also don't want to point out certain children who don't have certain things, and so some of those can trigger that.
And maybe some demographic information, like all of the schools within the urban environment within our Shelby County, which is a large school district that serves over 100,000 students. Based on demographic information statistics, Memphis has one of the poorest zip codes in the nation. Or, I'm sorry, the poorest zip code in the nation within the city.
Thank you for that. So we have a lot of literature that we looked at, coming from looking at emotional behavior disorders, multi-tiered systems of support, as well as trauma-informed care. So when looking at some of the literature, it states that common EBDs such as anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorders have similarities within their different symptoms that they present. And so it's important that we look at some of those intervention methods and notice that they may be able to collide in some form of way. So symptoms of EBD often reveal themselves in the forms of behaviors, okay, through our thought processes and how we may act and work with different individuals. And then EBD is often treated through the use of interventions, including medication and the manipulation of a student's social and learning environment, in which what we may find within our different settings, we find ways to implement something new to help support that child in that way. So when we go into multi-tiered systems of support, we know that this came about from the push of RTI, and then we had PBIS, and we found, hey, how can we put these two together? And so that's where MTSS was birthed, from looking at how we can better support our students within their academics and their behavior, okay? It's just basically the merging of those. And so then going into trauma-informed care, and that's what we're going to be doing here today, is looking at how can we now merge trauma-informed care into this joint model, okay? So trauma-informed care is an approach that is used to provide services that's sensitive to the possibility that children and families have experienced past or ongoing traumatic situations with implications for their current functioning and response to different interventions. And then over 2/3 of children residing in the United States have experienced at least one form of a traumatic experience during their lifetime. And so I had stated earlier what some of those different traumatic experiences may be. It may be a death of a parent, it may be the incarceration of a parent, it may be abuse within the home, it may be neglect within the home in some form of way. And so traumatic triggers may have an effect on the student or the educator in some form of way. So raise your hand if you've ever heard of secondhand trauma. Okay, so I have about 25% in here. Secondhand trauma is something of when we go into the classroom or if we're talking with individuals who are going through traumatic experiences, we can take on their trauma and then now that affects us. So if you've ever found yourself, if you found out that one of your children may have been, they lost a parent, okay? Me personally, if I hear that, I get sad. I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, I can only imagine how it feels to lose a parent. Now that is secondhand trauma to me because now I'm thinking, wow, how would I feel if I lost my parent? And I can take myself down this rabbit hole in some form of way. So it's important for us to understand how other individuals' trauma can affect us, okay? And so those boundaries and looking at and being conscious of what we're taking in is why it's very important when we're looking at trauma-informed care. So the essentials of trauma-informed care. Connection is the first piece, okay? Relationship building. Relationship building. You will not know and understand an individual unless you have an understanding of who they are as a person, okay? Oftentimes, a student, you may find that it's difficult to teach them within the classroom, but what is your connection with them? I always like to ask, when I was working within the school district, I worked on a team, which was our safe and civil team. And so when I would have to coach with teachers, I would ask them, can you tell me 3 things about your student that doesn't relate to their academics? And you would be amazed at how many teachers could not tell me 3 things about their students that did not relate to school, okay? And the more we learn and connect with our students, the better we will have a chance to connect with them. And when we connect, we feel that sense of comfort. It feels like a safe space, okay? And so it's very important that we get to know not just our students, but our colleagues as well, because we have to work with them, and just like how we go through trauma, they go through trauma, okay? And so that's important for our school aspect. But then we also want to protect. We want to create a safe space. We want our students to know that when you come into this space, you are not being judged. When you come in here on this next day, you are on a clean slate. So what you did yesterday is not affecting how I treat and work with you on today, okay? And that's very important, definitely when we have the rise of different diversity within our classroom, okay? We even have students who may fall within the LGBT spectrum, and so they may find areas where they're not in a safe space, and so they may really need that within your classroom to see, hey, are you an ally for me? You have students who may be survivors of sexual assault, so it's important for you to understand, okay, what does it look like for a child who may not do well with certain authoritative figures? How can I present myself in a different way so that they can feel protected and safe in this space and not feel like we're fighting each other in the classroom? Because if a child is feeling like they're fighting you, you're not going to be able to get them to do anything. Next, we have respect. It's important to engage in choice and collaboration. I like to say that our children are experts in themselves. We may be the experts in looking at how we can teach them and find different instructional methods, but at the end of the day, that child is an expert in themselves. So we need to respect that within them and say, hey, what can I learn from you? How can you teach me? Bring them into the conversation so that then they can start taking some of those leadership roles and let them teach you. And you will see a big difference in how they may interact and work with you within the classroom. And then that last piece, the redirect, teach and reinforce. So encourage those different skill buildings and competence, okay? We won't get it on the first day, probably. You probably won't get it on the second day. You may not even get it in that first month, depending on where that child is at, okay? But through that resilience and that persistence, it will come. It will come. It just takes a little bit longer, a little bit sometimes for you to redirect, but just keep doing it and be consistent. Because children, as we may know from the research, children with EBD, especially, they need structure. It's important to have structure and consistency. Definitely from looking at the EBD as well as from the trauma aspect. If I know I'm coming in and I know what's going to be happening in this class, I will then have more of a comfort because now I understand what's going on, okay? So that's why it's important to keep reteaching what's going on. Don't get upset at your students if they forget something, reteach it. They want to know it, they want to learn. That's why they come and that's why they're there.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, in terms of trauma-informed care, we're looking at the lit review in terms of students with emotional behavioral disorders. I want to ask you a few questions when it comes to behavior, and they were reciprocal questions. And I learned this heard this question at a conference about a year ago, where do we suspend students because they cannot read? However, students are being suspended because of behavior. Now, granted, if you have students that are taking, if it's drug paraphernalia or weapons, and of course you go through the discipline system, but for disruptive behavior, especially with students with emotional behavioral disorders, should they really be suspended? And if you look at IDEA's 1997 amendment, it's essential to include positive behavior intervention supports, which is out of MTSS, within the individual education program. So with that said, the way how RTI works on the academic side, you have tier 1, you have tier 2, you have tier 3, and if your state is using a discrepancy model, after tier 3, and they'll get tested for a learning disability, But of course, to do that, there's an assessment team, there's further interventions. So after all of that, then potentially that student could be identified with learning disability. Now from the PBIS side, not making this up, 1997 amendment. If you're bringing a student through tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 from the PBIS side, and we're gonna get into that more, and then look at the team in terms of identifying that student for an emotional behavior disorder, which IDEA's definition says between 4 weeks and 4 months, potentially this student could be identified. But if this process is not being followed, and I'm talking about the PBI side, question for you, can this contribute to disproportionality of students of color being identified for emotional behavior disorders? So when you look at emotional behavior disorders, this is the population that's most likely to drop out of high school, most likely to participate in the school to prison pipeline. And when some of the students with emotional behavior disorders suffer from trauma, it's really hard to concentrate within class. And then you're looking at from behaviorists, and I'm not a behaviorist, I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm not a behaviorist. Either they're trying to escape or draw attention to whatever behavior is taking place. So in terms of the tier support, and this is now looking at the classroom, and this goes, we're going to use this as a constant reference, this particular document. The hope is to get everyone at 80%, which is tier 1. And this is your everyday instruction. But again, going back to the information I discussed before about moving people through, you have a smaller group in tier 2. And then that's where you can provide that support. Even in a self-contained classroom, if you have classroom levels set up where you have a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, as a self-contained EBD teacher, it's a lot easier to do wraparound services for 1 or 2 students within that 10-person classroom. Perfect world, 10 students, because 10 students with emotional behavior disorders, it's like a 50-student classroom, in my humble opinion. And then if you have a paraprofessional that's there, that support where you can help that 1 or 2 student versus all 10 students need wraparound services. And then another thing, think about, even when we talk about trauma, and there's different triggers, let's be honest. If you're an EBD teacher, have you had a student, had all 10 or 12 students in crisis mode at one time? I haven't. It may have been like 3 out of 12 or 5 out of 12. Now those 5 are in crisis mode and the structure's not set up. Then they will, as Monica eloquently described, would trigger the other ones, including the teacher, and now everybody's in crisis mode. But initially, my hypothesis is that that 50% is not going to be in crisis mode within your class. So these supports help maintain those students who are in crisis mode and provide them the support. Can you kind of help me describe that?
Well, basically, and it's going back to the last piece that I was stating, we're looking at the framework of how we're looking at trauma-informed care. We have to understand that you can't do number 2 without number 1. You can't do number 3 without number 2. And so it's a process. You have to first make sure it's a safe environment. Same thing as us as adults. We need to feel safe in the space to want to speak up and say something. If I don't feel safe to speak up and say something, there's no way that I'm even be able to now be conscious to understand my personal trauma and what's going on, or even why I don't feel safe to speak in this space, okay? And then also the making connection with others, that comes once you have that sense of understanding of what's going on. And so we're utilizing this framework as we frame the work of trauma-informed care, and when we're looking at how we may want to bring for a trauma-informed care school and classroom. All right, so now we are going to take a moment to do a do now, okay? You have the sample student fact survey, and if there's someone who doesn't have it, please just raise your hand, and Dr. Hunter will bring it. Hopefully we have it. We weren't expecting such a full house today.
I know. I think we're done.
Oh, that's okay. If we could share, and then we'll have an ability if you want to give us your email address, and I can send the information to you to take back with you. Okay?
That's a good thing, though, right?
We were afraid, like, what we have to see? So we are going to take the next 3 minutes to just complete this sample student survey based off your own personal self, okay? And we're gonna take this moment at a voice level 0 and independent, okay? And we are going to work, and so you can begin now.
About 2 more minutes left.
We have about 60 more seconds.
All right, so we're going to transition to the next activity, and this is the model. If you look at your tier support document, there's research that says that, and I didn't believe this initially when I did the number heads together work with students with emotional behavioral disorders, and I thought like, okay, one of IDA's definitions of EBD's issues with interpersonal relationships, so I'm going to put them in cooperative learning groups. I was wrong. So one of the big support for students with emotional behavioral disorders within the trauma-informed care MTSS framework is peer groups, peer partners, with structure, with expectations. So at this time, if you can model, take a few moments to discuss with your neighbor how the survey may be useful within a potential classroom.
To use with your students. All right, let's go and bring it back in 3, 2, and 1. So this survey is something that I actually implemented in my my class for my 9th grade ELA classes. And what I found was that the students got excited to know that Miss B, that's what they call me, that Miss B cared to know what they liked, okay? And so then what I was able to do throughout the year, I was able to have different conversations with the students around what I learned that they liked. And so that started with that relationship building piece of them like, she's actually listening to me, okay? And it helped build that relationship to the point where probably by the end of the semester, about a good 50% of my students call me mom. And it took me a while to be okay with that because I'm like, I don't have children and I am too young to have children your age. But I also took that as a compliment because they felt comfortable with me and they felt that I cared for them. And so I took that for what it was. And so we're going to let Dr. Hunter take over.
All right, so now going back to that triangle and going to the framework. So think about positive behavior intervention supports, response to intervention. These are frames. So I learned from a PBIS conference a couple years ago, you cannot just do PBIS today, or it's not an intervention, it's a framework. So if you think about a house that's already framed up, TIC, trauma-informed care, could be one room. Collaborative problem solving could be another room. There's different elements that you can put within the frame. And I think that, full transparency, from our research world, I was not really informed, no pun intended, about trauma-informed care. I was informed by practitioners, K-12. So this is a demonstration to connect K-12 with researchers in the educational setting. So looking at Tier 1 for PBIS and RTI, this is for all students. Again, perfect world, if we can get up to 80 or 90%, we're in good shape. In terms of explicit teaching, awareness of the student, which Monica eloquently described as far as using the survey and having an awareness of the student triggers, this is still information that can be provided or should be done within your Tier 1 support, going that extra mile. In terms of RTI trainings, school-wide, and this is a conversation potentially you can bring back with your principal. Because again, going back to suspension of students with emotional behavior disorders, before they suspended, questions to ask, what type of interventions are we using? Are we using PBIS? Are we using trauma-informed care? Is King and nonviolent practice a particular strategy to use? If restorative justice or restorative practices something that can be used within the classroom? And some of the old school EBD teachers may say, I haven't used none of that. And I'm not even talking about positive reinforcement, token economies, and things of that nature. So just imagine if all of these items are packaged together, then your Tier 3 student, that one Tier 3 student may need to be suspended 5 days out of the 10-day limit, possibly for something major, versus half the classroom being removed for disruptive behavior, which is something we already know because that's how they're identified. And going back to Tier 1, PBIS, you can see the connection with TIC where the expectations are provided. Research says that students with ADHD, and some of your students with EBD may have ADHD, maybe not, possibly, respond well to visual and verbal prompts. Respond well to expectations. Just like when you get on the airplane, no matter how many times you fly, they're going to tell you about the emergency exit. They're going to tell you about the expectations, procedures for the plane. In terms of working with students with emotional behavior disorders, research has identified going over those expectations. And also, when you think about trauma-informed care, if anxiety is a component, you can potentially lessen the anxiety by providing the expectations for the day, for the activity. Because you have some students that will even get set off if you put a timer on. So, okay, if you're gonna put the timer on, after 4 minutes, that's it, we'll transition to the next activity, but at the end of this period, you will still have time to work. And that may help with some of those other students who really wanna work hard Because I don't know if you worked with some of the students with EBD, that they weren't really successful. Now they're successful in your classroom. They really want to work hard, but then if they feel like they fail, they blow up all over again. So that's something to kind of think about. So now we're going to tier 2, and we're looking at small group scaffolded lesson plans. It's really, it kind of falls back to, again, good teaching. There's some people that believe that students with learning disabilities are potentially not benefactors of not good teaching, if that makes sense. So when you look at scaffolding, explicit instruction, using direct instruction, connecting to high leverage practices, the CDC high leverage practices really walk you through on what good teaching looks like, whether it's from the collaboration, whether it's from the assessment domain, the social emotional domain, and the instructional domain. Putting that good teaching package together will help your students in a trauma-informed environment, care environment. And then with PBIS, one thing to look at is conflict management. So as a teacher, I was fearful initially of putting students in cooperative learning groups together, but I was doing them a disservice. Because if they do not know how to do interact within a cooperative learning group, if they're unsure about conflict management, then how are they going to do when they work at McDonald's or a grocery store, for their first job? Customer comes to them and they cuss them out and they get fired. So they have to learn somewhere, right?
And just adding a piece on those intentional small groups, sometimes it becomes easy for us to just like, all right, this table's gonna work together, this table's gonna work together, and this table's gonna work together. But to be intentional, you're able to identify what are each individual student's strengths and what can they bring to this small group. So if you know that one student may be a big trigger to another student, you may not want to put them together, okay? So you want to be intentional when you're putting your students in different groups of like, okay, they will be able to bring the best out of each other.
All right, so then when we're looking at tier 3, where it says individual student plans, but you can still tie that into the IEP, so we're strictly talking about students with emotional behavioral disorders. Really, what does the progress monitoring look like as far as, and I'm sticking to the academic side, are the needs assessment, because with the IEP, I know it's due annually, but if you're really looking at the progress monitoring, the IEP can change within 3 or 4 years based on progress monitoring. So, which is connected to their individual student plans and based on your needs. And going back to explicit procedures, to explicit instruction, from the academic standpoint. From the PBIS standpoint, now we could really get into that wraparound service. And hopefully it's 1 or 2 students that we're working with. Hopefully you have someone like Monica, who's a social worker that you're working with, or a counselor within. Now that counselor or social worker can provide some support. It's hard. I was working at a middle school where it was 1 counselor for about 600 or 700 students. And just imagine if there was not an effective tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So it's reactive. You're basically a counselor and a fire person, because that's all you're doing is putting out fires. So within the structured system, now you can provide that wraparound service and connect with the community, depending on if the students in residential also, or potentially transition from residential services.
All right. So now we're going to get into some examples for each tier, okay? We won't spend too much time on each one of these. It's more so, I know I'm an individual who likes to ask why. I'm really big on why? But why? But why? But I guess that's why I'm in a doctoral program, huh? Research. So this first classroom support we're looking at is peer supports and relationship building, okay? And this is a tier 1 support that can be used within the classroom. So why would we want to use this tier? It helps increase your student buy-in. If you feel like you have a voice and a say, I'm going to want to be able to participate even more, okay? It increases your student responsibility and accountability. It helps them stay focused and stay on task. It decreases the challenges to authority, because now they feel like they're being used as some form of expert within this moment. It lowers the stress, intimidation, and anxiety. It helps students get answers and clarifications, and then it also helps them build rapport within their classmates, okay? They're able to build build those relationships with them as well, because peer relationships are just as important as teacher-student relationships. And so when do you use these? You may be able to use this one when a student is easily distracted, or you may find that they lose focus often. So you want to find a way, okay, how can I bring you in to now want to have to talk, okay? And then you also may want to use it when a student needs a little extra help or guidance, or when they may have trouble with organization because one of their peers may be good with it, okay? And so it will be helpful if that is a skill you want them to learn. Why don't I join them together to be partners, okay? So then now this student can help teach this student this, and then this student can probably help this student, with this area. And then also, when a student may be shy or timid, so they may find that you take steps. So before having them to, be able to be comfortable to talk out loud in the classroom, let's start small and get them comfortable with talking in a small one-to-one group, then a small group, and then push them to the piece of, all right, now they're talking out loud in class and they're feeling confident with that. And then when a student may seem withdrawn or isolated, or even when a student is new, because by implementing these pieces, when a student is new, they're able to make, I guess you can say, friends within those small groups, because now they have someone that they can kind of attach to and talk to and learn from. Do I have any questions on this one before I? All right. We're going to go to a tier 2 option now. Teach coping skills, or the check-in, check-out method, okay? So the check-in, check-out method is something where a student, they come to you and check in about whatever it is may be going on, okay? Then they also have a check-out system where you review, basically look at what had happened within that piece. But then you also have the different coping skills. So you would use both of these, why? To improve a kid's self-esteem and confidence. It increases your instruction time, and basically what this does is the less behaviors you have in your class that's disrupting, the more you have to be able to instruct, okay? Because we may find that we spend so much time correcting behaviors that we're actually losing probably a good 10 to 15 minutes of instruction each day within that class. Then you have, it decreases the time it takes to deal with a student's crisis or issues or meltdown. So if you're teaching them how to cope, they're able to now identify when they may be triggered in a certain aspect, and then they can kind of start self-teaching and bring themselves back down to where they need to be. Because we also want to teach those life skills. We want to teach transferable skills, something that they not only are doing within class, but then like stated, when they go to work, those are the same skills that they will be able to use when their boss may not be as accommodating as the teacher, but they're able to notice that and be able to talk themselves and de-escalate off that ledge. When a student is having trouble appropriately expressing their emotions or their sadness or disappointment, you're able to help them be able to pinpoint and talk through those, okay? And then we are having to frequently stop to console, encourage, or settle a child down. So if you feel that you're always doing that, it may be time to identify how can I teach some coping skills for my student in this area. All right, and then for tier 3, intensive support. So as we know, tier 3, we only want about what? 2 to 5%. We don't want a big group of our students in this tier 3. Our hopes is that we are able to catch our students in that tier 1, and if we have to get to tier 2, we hope that we can capture in that tier 2. But if we do get to that tier 3, we may use this one because it improves student accountability, it increases structure, provides feedback, it improves and establishes their daily home-school communication and collaboration. It helps the student to self-monitor and to be organized, motivated, and to have an incentive in some form of way. So the incentive does not have to be always an actual materialistic prize. The incentive we can teach them is, well, when we learn these skills, that can help us when we're in this aspect, okay? So if we know our student and something that motivates them, we can then use that to be, I guess, one of those bargaining pieces. I know you want to eventually play sports. So you know what, by learning this skill, when you get out there on the court, it'll help you to be able to critically think to know who to pass the ball to. And so in that moment, it brings them in like, wow, I want to be good. So I need to try to learn this, okay? And so then we may also use these when a student is completing little to no work, when a student is not participating, being involved, or taking part in the learning process, when a student has emotional issues or organization skills, when a student is exhibiting behavioral problems, or when they're having the low motivation again, but more intensively. All right, so I stated that you all had the sheet that gave the 3 different tiers of support. We can use these. Oh, sorry. Anyone else need one?
Yes.
And then behind Kim need one. All right, so these are some sample supports that can be used in each one. We won't go over all of them one by one, but these are things that you can look up and identify what you may be able to use within your classroom, okay? And so the next piece we have is, well, what now? I took this information, I got the information in, what am I about to do with this? How can I actually utilize this? And so the first step is to become aware of your personal traumas, triggers, and limits of emotional and behavioral problem solving. We have to be self-aware, okay? We have to be self-aware because when we're self-aware, we're able to then now notice other things around us and how we fit into that big spectrum. The next step, attend valuable trauma-informed trainings to continue building your knowledge, okay? So identify, you see someone trauma-informed care and teachers? Okay, how can I learn that? Go to those CEUs if you can, okay? Next one, learn your students and other people you interact with. So trauma-informed care within these practices, you can transfer this with your colleagues. You can transfer this also with your family. I find myself utilizing it with problematic family members as well that I may have difficulty with. I identify that and create those different boundaries. And then listen to people's silent communication. That is a big one, okay? Our students are oftentimes telling us something about themselves, but they're not using communicating words. They may use it by reserving away from you. They may have a problem with authority pieces. They may have outbursts of crying. Different things may come about that you should want to ask, what happened to you? Or what happened, okay? Sometimes in education, we'll ask, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? They can't always answer that question because they may not know why they're doing it or what happened. But within trauma informed, the main question that you always want to ask is, what happened? Change the question from why to what, and allow them to help to talk through and process that within themselves.
I think it goes back to kind of going full circle and making that point where having the opportunity to connect with that mental health professional. So I know when we think about students with emotional behavioral disorders, there is a mental health aspect to it. So some of these questions, some of these thoughts and recommendations that we're providing for you, you're exploring the true nature of the disorder of the students that you're working with. I know sometimes, and I could be preaching to the choir, it's difficult to work with some of these students because of the challenge of behavior versus trying to figure out what's triggering that challenge of behavior. And trauma-informed care is a form that can be used for that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to piggyback on what you're questioning.
Yes.
One of the things we use is, how can I help you? Because sometimes the child can't tell you or doesn't want to share the trauma or what's happened or even what they experienced that morning on the way in on the bus. But they're in that anxiety mode, they're in that shutdown, they're having that experience, and sometimes just saying, how can I help you, opens the door for them to say, I just need a minute, or I just need to leave the room for a little while, and then you can help them better. And so sometimes we got a lot of trauma training in our program, and we were like, okay, now what do we do with it? And when finally I asked one of the presenters, and she's like, just say, how can I help you? And that really did work. And it was just like one of the things that I was like, I hung on to after that. Because sometimes it just can't tell you in that moment. But if you say, how can I help you, they know you're trying to help them, and they can ask for whatever that is. That little bit.
Thank you for bringing that up. No, that is
Yeah.
very
That's a great
important.
point.
And that goes to the piece of allowing the student to be the expert because they know themselves better. They know what they need better than you do. So thank you for bringing that.
Let's practice that. How can I help?
How can I help
We're
you?
on three.
How can I help you?
Yes.
All right. So our conclusions, we already know childhood trauma can have a major impact on a student's academic performance. When handling unwanted behaviors, already asked what happened and not what is wrong. Trauma-informed care framework provides intentional support through MTSS. Because we talked about that. Sorry. All right, so do we have any questions? I know we talked about a lot.
This was really helpful. I love the way you broke it down in the one worksheet by the teachers. So thank you. That was really helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, if we don't have any questions, we have a quick survey. As I stated, I am a second-year doctoral student, and so this is actually my first presentation at a conference. And so I am open to the feedback that's within this quick survey. So if you could just take a few moments to complete that for me, that would be very helpful. And then we're gonna stay after so I can collect email addresses for those who may have not got some of the worksheets so we can make sure that we can get that sent to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.